Today I want to talk about Brazil's most famous 20th century populist leader, Gétulio Vargas. But before we jump into that story, we need to briefly discuss on theoretical grounds just what a populist leader does that makes him a populist in the first place. So the real question for today is, how does one do populism? And does the trajectory of Gétulio Vargas fit that bill? The two main theoretical perspectives I want to draw from here are Kurt Wayland's Populism as a Political Strategy and Benjamin Moffat's Populism as a Political Style. As we mentioned in an earlier video, Kurt Wayland, who specialized in Latin American populism specifically, understood it to be a strategy through which a personalistic leader seeks or exercises government power based on direct, unmediated, uninstitutionalized support from large numbers of mostly unorganized followers. In this case, a charismatically gifted leader will attempt to sidestep the existing institutional barriers to power by culling direct support from the masses and employing emotionally provocative and divisive rhetoric to do this. When we look at cases like Juan and Eva Perón in Argentina, this conceptualization of populism seems to make a lot of sense, especially when we consider the historical moment and the very new political opportunities that that moment presented. Here I'm talking about the sharp growth of the still mostly disenfranchised and ideologically self-conscious urban working classes, which in the 1930s and 1940s in both of these countries were something of a sleeping monster just waiting to be woke, so to speak. Strategically, awakening this monster and getting it on your side by, let's say, boisterously telling it just what it wants to hear, outside of, indeed of, in spite of the existing channels of representative government, now that we know now was a winning strategy. However, while looking at populism as a strategy does tell us why political leaders might successfully employ populist tactics in response to certain baseline demographic, economic, and historical conditions, or in other words, when populism will work, it doesn't really explain how one actually does populism per se. That sounds weird, I know. Hey man, how do you do populism? Well, thankfully, Benjamin Moffat has some ideas about this subject. His premise is more or less this. Everything that we perceive as reality is, in fact, just a social construction for which we create meaning by way of some kind of oft-repeated performance. As I mentioned in our last video, the people don't actually exist as an objective reality. They must be rendered present by a perpetually reenacted drama and discourse that reinforce the idea that we all share some common destiny. Likewise, the leader also has to be rendered present, or rather, he must perform leadership in a way that infuses his own physical being with some kind of supernatural meaning. What I'm talking about here is that the leader needs to convince his followers of something really that is impossible. That on one hand, he's literally of the people, while at the same time he is symbolically above the people, transcending them. In other words, he must be just as wretchedly ordinary as any old Joe six-pack.
Can't you see my whole body? You don't really want to see my whole body.
While also representing something far more powerful.
I beat China all the time. All the time.
As if the sum total of every ordinary thing was extraordinary, and that this extraordinary thing was this leader personally. As if he literally embodied the imagined greatness of an imagined people. Yeah, the populace must, by way of performance, turn the unbelievable into the deeply believed. And that's just plain magic. So, what's the trick? How does he do this magic? Well, according to Moffat, regarding the first part, the populace performs ordinariness by the rather simple mechanism of just having bad manners. Now, Moffat means this in the broadest of senses. That is, bad manners isn't just necessarily burping at the dinner table or farting in an elevator. Instead, this refers to any kind of behavior that is not sanctioned or embraced by society's elite, the bourgeoisie, if you will, but which is understood to be normal behavior for more humble folk, the likes of you and me. In the simplest, most benign version of this kind of bad manners performance, we can perhaps consider how every American president since John F. Kennedy has, at some point, donned a cowboy hat for a photo op. A message that at least attempts to say, hey people, I'm just like you, see? I ain't one of them Washington fuzzy math types.
This man's been disparaging my plan with all this Washington fuzzy math.
Of course, not every president can pull off the cowboy hat so convincingly, but they certainly all do try. In any case, what separates the populace from most other politicians is that the populace tends to take these bad manners a lot further, becoming overtly hostile to the established political elite in every expression of his being, usually assuming that this kind of brutish hostility is the natural expression of the common people. For Donald Trump, for instance, attacking so-called political correctness and telling it like it is was very key to his performance. And that meant speaking from the national podium in a way, in the same way that a working man might express himself down at the local saloon.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
It would seem that this performance was politically fruitful. Millions of Americans ended up feeling, deep in their gut, that they finally had a candidate that they could actually trust. Now, looking back at Juan and Eva Perón in Argentina, we see other clear examples of bad manners. For instance, the mere fact that a military general from high society married a working class actress girl was by itself such an affront to the norms of elite society that the disenfranchised working classes couldn't help but to fall in love with the both of them. It was a kind of proof, if you will, that Juan and Eva were actually of the people and consequently were not beholden to that much despised political class of bourgeois bastards that had ruled Argentina ever since the country's inception. However, according to Moffat, performing in ordinariness is not by itself enough to capture the fanatical loyalty of millions of people. I mean, after all, if it were, just about any old hillbilly could become president.
Come and listen to my story about a man named Jed. A poor mountaineer barely kept his family fed. And then one day he was shooting at some food, and up through the ground come a bubbling crude oil, that is, black gold.
Instead, the populist leader must also perform extraordinariness. As the symbolic or even literal embodiment of the people, he must find a way to portray himself not how the people are in reality, but how they would imagine themselves to be in their perfect world. Now, the simple way to put this would be to say that the populist must portray himself as physically strong, mentally astute, and always fearless in the face of danger. Basically, a superhero, pretty much how almost all of us, women and men, fantasize ourselves to be in our sort of tomorrow lives, since we usually can't quite live up to that today. Since most populists are men, this superhero performance often tends to have an overtly masculine tone, often in that traditional caveman sense, wherein the populist openly displays and exaggerates his male virility and hunger for sexual conquest, while publicly denigrating rivals for somehow being less than men. For example, in 2011, the smacktastic Italian prime minister and mega populist Silvio Berlusconi bragged that he had sex with 8 women in just one night, and he lamented that he couldn't handle the 3 more women that were still knocking at his door. Side note, this guy was in his 70s at the time. And yeah, well, this statement surely shocked a lot of people in Europe. The truth is, Berlusconi's support base loved it. They just ate this up. Likewise, condemning one's rivals for their lack of manliness is also quite common. Former Ecuadorian President Abdallah Bucaram, for example, once accused a rival of having watery sperm. Ese cornudo tiene la esperma aguada, hombre! And of course, our very own Donald Trump frequently belittled his opponents in slightly less sexually explicit ways.
I think Jeb is a nice person. He's very low energy. I'm not used to that kind of a person.
But in any case, the point here is that in order for the populist leader to be successful, he must simultaneously portray himself as the most common man among all common men, and also the most extraordinary man among extraordinary men. Now, whether or not you like the populists, you've got to admit, this takes some talent. Okay, we've reviewed 2 different perspectives on the populist leader, that of Kurt Wayland and that of Benjamin Moffat. Now let's finally take a brief look at the case of Brazil's Gétulio Vargas to see which best applies. Vargas came to power in the so-called Revolução de 1930, which was, in essence, a popular coup in which riled up junior military officers and labor union leaders all over the country rose up to overturn a presidential election outcome that they didn't like very much. Note that this was at the beginning of the Great Depression, and so pretty much everyone except the wealthy were feeling the strain of a contracting economy. And when I say strain, what I'm talking about is fairly widespread starvation as well as depressed wages and joblessness. So it was pretty bad. And what Vargas did was blame all of this despair on the old oligarchic elite that had hoarded its wealth while the poor starved to death in the streets. And he promised major structural changes to the country that would not only bring back jobs, but good, high-paying industrial jobs. Yes, he promised to modernize Brazil. He promised to break the back of the oligarchy which resisted such modernization, and he was going to bring Brazil into the 20th century where it rightfully belonged. And he was going to do this on behalf of the hitherto disenfranchised and forgotten working classes, thus incorporating them into national political society for the first time while portraying them as the real heroes of human progress, the people, o povo. The crazy thing is that Vargas actually did a lot of what he promised. He dramatically expanded Brazil's industrial sector. He built telegraph lines all across the country, connecting disparate cultural regions for the first time. He nationalized the country's oil production, and he incorporated the previously excluded working classes and peasantry into a national political dialogue. Importantly, he was also the first Brazilian president to openly celebrate the country's mixed racial and cultural history, embracing its African and indigenous roots, as well as its European roots, such that from that point on, the Brazilian nation would be de-Europeanized and far more inclusive of the vast majority of actual Brazilians. As a result of all these things, Vargas became wildly popular among the working classes and also with a substantial portion of the lower middle classes and the emerging industrial elite. To boost his popularity further, he carefully crafted an image of himself through a series of exquisite propaganda campaigns as a sort of loving father of the poor, someone who really cared, but who was also very strong and firm-handed and could get things done. Yeah, the poor came to love Vargas a lot. Like Juan Neve Perón, Vargas strategically targeted this ascendant majority of the population in order to harness its political potential. And to achieve this, he did so many of those things in the traditional populist playbook. I mean, he blamed everything on the oligarchy. He promised simple, if grandiose, solutions to very complex problems. He strategically nurtured a cult of personality around his own image. And yeah, I mean, this all fits really well with Kurt Whalen's conceptualization of populism as a political strategy. But what about Moffat's populism as a political style? Did Gétulio Vargas do populism by simultaneously performing ordinariness and extraordinariness? It may be fair to say that he performed extraordinariness by propagating an image of himself as father of the nation, but it's not clear if this was an actual performance or if it was just straight up strategic propaganda. After all, Vargas wasn't nearly so charismatic or outlandish as many of our contemporary populists, or even compared to those of his day like Juan Neve Perón. It would probably be better to compare his style to, say, Franklin Roosevelt. He and his allies helped to craft fatherly, compassionate image of him that was strategically associated with a sort of working class utopian modernism. But like Roosevelt, he never succeeded or even tried very hard to convince the masses that he was just like them. That is, he didn't really perform ordinariness, and definitely not through any kind of rough and tumble bad manners that Moffat talks about. In fact, most imagery of him in both photo and film indicates a performance, if you will, that might be better described as something between knightly and kingly. The people adored him all right, not because they saw him as a commoner like themselves, but because he was an uncommon man who credibly claimed to care about them. So, when we look at the populist leadership of Gétulio Vargas, which of our two theoretical perspectives makes the most sense? Whalen's strategy or Moffat's style? And to carry this question on up into our own times, is there anything different about populism today that would cause us to look at contemporary populists in a different light? You tell me. I'm Gétulio Vargas, and this is Populism and Democracy in America Online.